The Tale of the Regretful Boss, a story of power, desire, and consequence. Chapter 1. A Tempting Lure. It began innocently enough. A late meeting, a moment of shared laughter over an offhand comment, the kind of thing that might slip by unnoticed on a casual Tuesday evening. But beneath the surface of that seemingly trivial interaction, there was an undeniable current of something deeper. Something that neither of us wanted to acknowledge at first. My boss, Richard Blackwood, a man who carried the weight of his position with practiced ease, had always been authoritative yet strangely charismatic. He was the type who commanded a room without ever raising his voice. At 6'2", broad-shouldered, his crisp, tailored suits spoke to an air of sophistication, yet there was a quiet discomfort in his eyes that told a story of ambition, perhaps too much of it. I had always admired his work ethic, the way he made impossible tasks seem effortless, and I had longed to make my mark under his leadership. But as we spent more late hours together at the office, strategizing, working, sharing ideas, the boundaries began to blur. What was once respect began to morph into something more, a subtle, dangerous attraction. One evening, after a particularly challenging week of presentations, he asked me to stay late. "I need your help with something," he said, his tone less commanding than usual, a hint of vulnerability behind his words. I felt the weight of the moment settle over me. There was something intoxicating about the way he looked at me. Just a fleeting glance that suggested more than professionalism, a momentary lapse in his usual composure. My heart skipped. My mind told me to retreat, but I stayed. For the first time, I felt a flicker of something dangerous, something both thrilling and terrifying. Chapter 2. The decision that would change everything. In hindsight, I should have known better. Yet, when his touch brushed against my hand as we worked side by side on the documents, it felt like the world paused, holding its breath. A spark ignited within me, one that had been lying dormant, waiting for this very moment. His gaze locked with mine. A silent question passed between us. He didn't have to speak the words. I could see it in his eyes. He wanted me. And for reasons I still struggle to understand, I wanted him too. That night, the office, once sterile and indifferent, became a cocoon where time lost all meaning. The heat between us simmered, and before either of us could stop it, the lines were crossed. The first kiss was soft, tentative, but it was followed by something more urgent, more reckless. The world outside no longer mattered. What we had was a secret we would never speak of aloud. It felt like a heady rush, a momentary release of everything I had suppressed, a culmination of desire and power. But when the night ended, and the morning light began creeping through the office blinds, the weight of reality crashed down on me. What had just happened? I had betrayed myself, my integrity, and my future. And yet, part of me didn't regret it, at least not yet. Chapter 3. The Fallout. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy silence. Richard and I exchanged tense glances, the space between us charged with an electric tension. He became colder, distant, as though trying to erase the memory of what had transpired. I, on the other hand, felt a swirl of emotions, confusion, shame, and yet something else, something I couldn't name. Then, it happened. One afternoon, after a particularly stressful meeting, Richard cornered me in the office kitchen. His face was flushed, his voice clipped. "This can't continue. I'm your boss, and I can't afford for anyone to see us like this," he said, his words cutting through the air like a knife. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. So, this is it. I had known, deep down, this would happen. The man who had once seemed so full of confidence now looked like a fragile shell, as if the very nature of our transgression had shattered something within him. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His gaze darted around nervously, his fingers tapping against the countertop. "You don't understand. If this gets out, if anyone finds out, my reputation, my career, it's all at risk." I could feel the bile rise in my throat, the bitter sting of betrayal. This time from him, not from myself. His regret was palpable, but it wasn't for us. It was for his career, for his power. He wasn't sorry for what he had done to me. He was sorry because it could cost him everything. I looked at him, searching his face for something that would justify his actions, anything that might make me feel better about the betrayal, but there was nothing. There was only his cold, calculating demeanor, the man who had used his position of power to exploit my vulnerability. Chapter 4. The Price of Ambition. Weeks passed. I did my best to push past what had happened, to focus on my work. Chapter 5. Shattered Illusions and Silent Reckonings. The days that followed Richard's public downfall felt like an endless stretch of gray. The office had turned into a battleground of whispers and pointed glances. It was as though everything around me had shifted. Nothing was the same, least of all myself. I had witnessed the consequences of ambition, of power unchecked by integrity, and now I could no longer look at Richard in the same way. But more than that, I couldn't look at myself the same way either. The fleeting thrill that had once sparked between us, the intoxicating rush of forbidden attraction, now felt hollow and strange. It was as if the kiss, the touch, had taken something from me that I would never get back. My sense of control, my dignity, my trust in my own judgment. I tried to bury these thoughts, to push them aside as I focused on my work, but they lingered, haunting every decision I made. I no longer sought Richard's approval, no longer desired to impress him, and yet part of me couldn't escape the feeling of wanting to prove something, not just to him, but to myself, to show that I was more than just a pawn in a game of power, more than a footnote in his fall from grace. As the weeks passed, Richard's fate was sealed. He was fired, his reputation irrevocably damaged. The company moved on without him, the space he had once occupied now filled by someone else. His departure was swift, cold. No farewell, no acknowledgement of what had happened. It was as if he had never mattered, as though his presence had been nothing more than a fleeting illusion. And yet the world did not stop turning. I was still here, still standing, still caught between the past and the future, between guilt and relief. Chapter 6. The weight of powerlessness I had never expected, to feel the way I did when Richard was gone. There was a sense of emptiness that lingered long after his departure, a sense of disillusionment that I couldn't shake. I had watched him crumble, watched him lose everything, and yet there was no sense of triumph in it for me. There was no sense of justice, only a profound, unsettling silence that settled into my bones. In the weeks that followed, I found myself replaying every moment, every word, every touch. What had I truly wanted from him? What had I hoped to gain by crossing that line? I could no longer deny it. I had been as complicit in the affair as he was. He had used his power, but I had willingly played my part. And in the aftermath, I saw just how easily I had been swept into the tide of ambition, how quickly I had traded my own integrity for a moment of fleeting desire. How had I let myself fall for him? The question echoed in my mind like a mantra, reverberating with guilt, with regret, with longing for a version of myself that never existed. I wanted to blame him, to point the finger, but I knew that doing so would only make me a prisoner of the past. What had happened was done. The aftermath was my own to deal with. I had spent so many years striving to climb the corporate ladder, believing that success would bring me happiness. But now I realized it had only brought emptiness. I had allowed ambition to cloud my judgment, to drown out my moral compass, and now I was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered illusion. Chapter 7. The Ripple Effect of Betrayal. Despite the passing of time, the damage Richard had caused was still felt in the office. Colleagues whispered his name in hushed tones, as though his actions were a stain on the company's reputation. And I, too, was tainted by association. I found myself becoming more withdrawn, more guarded. People who had once seen me as a rising star now regarded me with suspicion, their eyes narrowing when they spoke to me. It was as if the affair had changed everything, not just for Richard, but for me as well. I had become an unspoken part of the scandal, a casualty of a momentary lapse in judgment. Yet, as much as I tried to distance myself from the fallout, there were those who saw beyond the rumors. One of them was my colleague, Emma, a woman who had worked alongside me for years. She was one of the few people who didn't treat me differently, who didn't cast me aside in the wake of the scandal. One evening, as we sat together at a quiet bar nursing our drinks, she looked at me with a knowing expression. "You're not the same," she said softly, her voice cutting through the noise of the bar. "You've changed since all of this happened. It's like you've lost something." I didn't have to ask her what she meant. I knew. "I've lost a lot," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "My own sense of who I am, for one, and my trust in people, in myself." She took a sip of her drink, watching me carefully. "It's not easy, is it? Letting go of the past, of the choices we made. But you can't keep carrying this around. You can't keep punishing yourself." I wanted to argue, to tell her that I wasn't punishing myself, that this was something I had to live with, that I had to make up for. But I knew she was right. I had to stop being a prisoner of my own guilt. I had to reclaim myself from the wreckage I had allowed to unfold. Chapter 8. The Road to Redemption. Months passed, and I began to rebuild my life. Slowly but surely, I found a new path, one that didn't revolve around ambition or power, but around something much more important, my own sense of integrity. I sought out new opportunities, not for the sake of climbing the corporate ladder, but for the sake of personal growth, for the chance to prove to myself that I was more than the mistakes I had made. Richard's name faded from the office gossip, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale. But for me, the lesson had been far more personal. It wasn't just about the betrayal, it was about the price of unchecked ambition, the danger of letting desire cloud judgment. In the end, I realized that power, influence, and status were fleeting. The only thing that remained in the wake of it all was the integrity of the choices we make and the people we become in the process. The transformation was slow, but it was real. And in that, I found the peace I had longed for. Chapter 9. The Echo of Choices. It's strange how time works, how it heals, but also how it marks. I had come so far in my journey to reclaim myself, yet the echoes of that period still lingered in my thoughts, in my decisions, in the way I interacted with the world. What had once felt like the end of everything had, in many ways, become the beginning of something new. But still, the past never truly let go. It hummed beneath the surface, quiet yet insistent. The company had found its new equilibrium, a balance restored after Richard's departure. Yet, for me, the work became less of a battleground and more of a reflection, a place where I sought meaning and purpose in the things I did. I no longer sought validation through the approval of my superiors or the praise of my colleagues. Instead, I started working for myself, for a version of me that could stand proud, free of the past that had once tried to define me. And yet, every so often I would catch myself in moments of silence, haunted by the realization that no matter how far I'd come, I could never completely forget the taste of betrayal. I could never unsee the man Richard had been, the man he'd become, and the role I'd played in it all. Chapter 10. A New Face, a New Beginning. It was one afternoon when the unexpected visitor arrived. I had taken to working in a quiet corner of the cafe near my apartment, the steady hum of conversations and the smell of freshly ground coffee beans offering a small comfort in the solitude. My laptop was open, the soft clicking of keys filling the space as I worked on a project that had captivated my attention for weeks. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him, Richard. My heart skipped a beat, a strange, tight knot forming in my chest. He stood at the door for a moment, as if uncertain whether to enter before he saw me. Recognition flickered in his eyes, and for a brief second, the weight of history seemed to press down on both of us. Neither of us moved at first. It felt as if the air between us had thickened, charged with unspoken words and regrets. Finally, he walked over to me, his steps tentative, almost hesitant. He looked older now, his face drawn, his once sharp suit replaced with a simple shirt and jeans. There was no power in his demeanor, no confidence, only a quiet weariness. I had expected him to come with apologies, but all he did was sit down, his gaze fixed on me as if waiting for me to say something. I closed my laptop, the motion deliberate. "I didn't expect to see you here," I said, my voice steady but laced with an emotion I couldn't quite name. He looked at me, his eyes searching. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," he admitted, his words soft, almost regretful. "I know I'm the last person you'd want to talk to." I could have told him to leave, could have excused myself, but instead I sat in the silence for a moment longer, my gaze meeting his. The years of bitterness, anger, and betrayal felt like a distant memory now. They didn't haunt me the way they once had, though they still lingered beneath the surface, faintly echoing in the space between us. "I don't know what you want from me, Richard," I said, my tone now softer, as if the hardness of the past had begun to dissolve. "But if you're looking for redemption, it's not something you'll find from me." He nodded, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I didn't come for that. I came to understand. He faltered, pausing before continuing. "To apologize for everything." The words hung in the air, and for a moment I felt something shift. The old desire to see him punished, to make him suffer, had long faded, replaced by something else, a desire for closure, for resolution. Not for him necessarily, but for me. Chapter 11. The Weight of Forgiveness. "I never thought I'd hear you say that," I said quietly. There was a slight tremor in my voice, one I hadn't expected, but I let it go. Richard shifted in his seat, his hands clenched around his coffee cup. "You deserved better than I gave you. I've spent months, hell, longer than that, regretting everything. And I know it doesn't matter now, but I have to say it. I'm sorry for the way I treated you, for the way I used you." I could feel the sincerity in his voice, but something held me back. The old wounds, the memories of what had happened. Between us, still stung, but there was a part of me that realized, finally, that my healing didn't lie in holding on to the pain. It lay in letting go. I took a slow breath, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I can't change the past, Richard," I said, my voice a little stronger now. "And I can't forget it, but I can choose how I move forward. We both can." Richard looked at me, as if searching for some sign of what I was truly thinking. I knew then that he wasn't seeking forgiveness, not in the way I had once hoped. He wasn't asking for my absolution. He was asking for peace. Chapter 12. Reclaiming the Future. The weeks following Richard's visit blurred by like the soft fading of a storm. The tension that had lived in my chest for so long had begun to evaporate, replaced by a quiet sense of clarity. I had let go of the need for closure, for some grand act of vengeance or apology. I had walked away from that chapter. not because I was unaffected, but because the past could no longer control the direction of my life. I was no longer a victim of betrayal, no longer someone defined by someone else's choices. I had stepped into my own power quietly, without fanfare. It wasn't easy, but nothing of value ever is. Chapter 13. The Unseen Depths of Freedom. In the stillness of my apartment one evening, the city lights casting long shadows across the floor, I found myself at a crossroads. I had always defined my identity by the roles I played: a colleague, a friend, a lover. But now, for the first time in years, I realized that I didn't need to fit into those expectations anymore. The walls I had built to protect myself from the world had come down, and what was left in their place was a person who had endured, who had learned, and who was ready to move forward, not in spite of the pain, but because of it. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts. My thumb hovered over names that had once meant everything to me, people I had once relied on. And yet, none of them felt quite right to call. I had changed, and they had too, but maybe not in the ways I had hoped. Instead, I found myself dialing a different number, one I had let go of years ago. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar at first, but as soon as he spoke, I recognized it. James, an old friend from years ago, before the storm of Richard's betrayal had swept through my life. He had been there, in the periphery, when I had shut myself off from the world. His voice was warm, and it carried a familiarity that felt like stepping into an old, comfortable jacket. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his tone immediately concerned. "Yeah," I said, smiling into the phone. I've been thinking about things, about how much I've changed. I feel like I've been running away from myself for so long, but now I just want to reconnect, with myself, with others." There was a brief pause, then a soft laugh on his end. "You sound different, in a good way." "I hope so," I said, feeling a weight lifting from my chest. "I've learned a lot, about what it means to be strong, but also about what it means to trust again, not just in others, but in myself. And for the first time in a long time, I realized I meant it." Chapter 14. Embracing New Beginnings. The next few months were a journey I hadn't expected. With James, we slowly rebuilt the connection that had once felt so natural but had been lost in the flood of time and life's complexities. We met for coffee, for walks in the park, for conversations that spanned hours. There was no rush, no pressure. Just the freedom to be who we were now, people shaped by the experiences that had molded us, but no longer defined by them. I also found myself stepping into new opportunities at work. I was no longer chasing validation from others. Instead, I was trusting my instincts, leaning into my strengths, and using my voice in ways I hadn't before. My creativity flourished. My leadership skills came to the forefront, and I began to see that there was more to my worth than the image I had so carefully cultivated to protect myself. I had learned, through the sharpest of lessons, that the measure of my worth was never tied to someone else's approval. It was within me, forged by the very struggles that had threatened to break me. Chapter 15. The Return of the Past. But even in the midst of this new chapter, the past had a funny way of resurfacing. It was in a chance meeting at a company event, a reunion of sorts for old colleagues. As I entered the room, I saw familiar faces, some of them warm with smiles, others cold with distance. And there, near the back, was Richard. He looked the same, but there was a hollowed-out quality to him now. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes no longer sharp, and his usual confidence was absent, replaced by a quiet desperation. When our eyes met, I felt nothing. No anger, no desire for retribution. just a kind of detachment. The years had passed, and what had once been an all-consuming bitterness had faded into nothingness. He walked toward me, a hesitant smile on his lips. "I see you've done well," he said, his voice low. I didn't immediately respond. I simply let the silence hang between us, the years of shared history too heavy to ignore. I took a deep breath, then said the only thing I could. "Life has a way of teaching you, doesn't it?" I said, my voice steady, my gaze unwavering. "We learn. We grow." He nodded, his face a mixture of regret and resignation. "I thought I could control everything. I thought I had it all figured out." He paused, his gaze lingering on me. "But you were right about one thing. I didn't deserve your trust." I looked at him for a moment longer, the weight of his words settling inside me. And then, without a word, I turned and walked away. Not because I was angry, but because I knew I didn't need to carry that anymore. I had learned the most important lesson of all, that forgiveness, in the end, was never about him. It was about me. It was about finding peace within myself, without waiting for anyone else to give it to me. Chapter 16. The Power of Choice. As the years unfolded, I began to understand the true power of choice. The choices I made now, how I treated myself, how I allowed others to treat me, and how I moved through the world, were mine and mine alone. I couldn't change the past, but I could shape my future. And as I stood at the threshold of this new phase in my life, I felt something I hadn't in. Here's hope, hope for what was to come, for the relationships I would build, and for the woman I had become. I had walked through fire, but I was no longer burned. I was stronger, wiser, and ready for the next chapter, and this time, I knew I was ready to write it on my own terms. Chapter 17. The Unseen Path Forward. The days that followed the reunion with Richard were filled with an almost surreal sense of calm. I had thought I would feel something more, anger, perhaps, or even a fleeting desire for revenge. But as I reflected on my life, I realized that the power I had been seeking all these years wasn't in getting even with him. It was in learning to stand tall on my own, unburdened by the weight of the past. But life, as always, had a way of pulling me forward, sometimes gently, sometimes with a force I couldn't ignore. Chapter 18. The Ripple of Unspoken Words, James. And I continued to rebuild our friendship, the foundation of our bond growing with each shared conversation and quiet moment of understanding. But something deeper was beginning to stir inside me. The silence between us, the unspoken tension, began to thrum with a new awareness. There were moments where our eyes would meet, and I could feel the air shift, an unspoken recognition that something more was on the horizon, something neither of us could deny. We had known each other for so long, and in those quiet moments, I began to see the contours of a different kind of relationship emerging. One not built on the pain of the past, but on the understanding that we had both been through our own journeys of growth and self-discovery. One night, after a long conversation over wine, he reached out, his hand brushing mine as our fingers lingered together. It was a subtle touch, but one that carried the weight of years, of unspoken words. My breath caught in my chest, and I could feel my heart pick up its pace. I turned my hand over, letting my palm rest against his. It felt natural. There was no rush, no pressure to define what it meant. There was just the warmth of his touch and the quiet knowing that something had changed between us. Something real, something worth exploring. "I've missed this," James said quietly, his voice a tender whisper in the soft hum of the room. "Missed what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Missed the connection we had before. But this time," he paused, his thumb brushing gently across my hand. I think it could be something more. I didn't answer immediately, not because I didn't feel the same pull, but because I needed to be sure. I had learned so much about myself, about trust, and I couldn't allow myself to rush into anything without understanding the full weight of what it meant. So I simply said, "We'll see where this goes," slowly. And with that, we both understood. There was no need for words beyond that moment, no need to rush the inevitable. The future was as much about savoring the present as it was about planning ahead. And so, we let the future come to us in its own time. Chapter 19. The space between expectations and reality. As I navigated the ebb and flow of my personal life, I found my professional life taking on a different trajectory as well. With the lessons I had learned in the wake of betrayal, I was able to approach my career with a renewed sense of purpose. I was no longer chasing approval from those in power, nor was I constantly second-guessing my decisions. The confidence I had built was no longer fragile. It was rooted in something far deeper than external validation. It was a quiet power that came from within, from knowing my worth and the value I brought to the table. I no longer feared failure, for I had learned that failure wasn't a reflection of my inadequacy. It was simply another lesson in the ever-unfolding story of who I was becoming. I took on projects I had once been afraid to attempt, tackling them not with the reckless abandon of a person seeking approval, but with the focused intent of someone who knew their own capabilities. I no longer sought perfection, but progress. And in this space, I began to thrive in ways I had never imagined. My colleagues noticed the change. My voice, once hesitant, now commanded attention in meetings. My ideas, once buried beneath self-doubt, now stood at the forefront of every conversation. And with each small victory, I began to see the fruits of my transformation. Chapter 20. The Unexpected Return. And then, just when I had settled into this new rhythm, life threw another curveball. It came in the form of an email from Richard. He had finally realized, it seemed, the gravity of his actions. The words were brief, yet laden with sincerity. He admitted that he had been wrong, that he had made mistakes, and that he regretted how things had turned out between us. But it wasn't an apology I needed anymore. It was a reminder that the past had been let go, and there was nothing more to be gained by reopening old wounds. The message lingered in my inbox for days, and yet, when I finally responded, my words were carefully measured. I was no longer the woman who needed validation from him. I was no longer the person defined by his betrayal. I replied, "Thank you for your message." Chapter 22. The Quiet Revolution. The warmth of summer lingered in the air as I found myself walking through the city streets one afternoon, the light filtering through the trees in a way that felt almost sacred. It was a moment of peace, one I had not known in years. As I passed by the park, a light breeze tugging at my hair, I felt the weight of the past fall away even further, like old leaves drifting from a branch, leaving room for new growth. I had transformed. The woman I was, the woman shaped by betrayal and loss, had been tempered into someone else entirely. The emotional upheaval that had once consumed me now seemed a distant echo, a lesson learned, not a wound that defined me. But it was in this newness that I began to see something I hadn't anticipated, a truth that had eluded me before. I wasn't just living for myself anymore. I wasn't simply going through the motions of a life that had been handed to me, I was creating it. And in that creation, I had come to understand something deeper about the way I had lived before, the way I had lived under the weight of others' expectations, of unspoken obligations. And so, I took a step forward, not to a destination, but to a journey that was unfolding with a quiet confidence. Chapter 23. The Doorway to Possibilities. James and I had found our rhythm in a way that felt both natural and profound. There were no grand declarations, no desperate attempts to cling to something that might slip through our fingers. We had learned the art of letting things flow, of understanding that the strongest bonds aren't always the loudest ones. Ours was a partnership forged in trust, in respect, and in the gentle giving of space to one another. But even as our relationship deepened, I felt the tug of something else calling me. A need to redefine not only my personal life, but my professional world as well. I had spent so many years driven by ambition, my every move dictated by the desire to prove myself. But as I sat in my office late one evening, staring at the documents before me, I realized that what I had once sought, approval, recognition, was no longer enough. I had outgrown the need for validation. I wanted more than success. I wanted purpose. With this new clarity, I began to reshape my career, not as a stepping stone to someone else's vision, but as a canvas for my own. I began taking on projects that reflected my true passions, that allowed me to work in ways that felt authentic. I redefined what success meant for me, not as the world saw it, but as I saw it. I started mentoring young women in the industry, helping them navigate the same challenges I had faced. In doing so, I found a deep satisfaction, one that went beyond accolades or titles. It was in the quiet moments of guidance, in the way their eyes lit up when they understood their own worth, that I realized what I had truly been seeking all along, the opportunity to give back, to pass on the lessons I had learned. Chapter 24. The Reckoning of Silence. It had been a year since Richard's apology, a year since the echoes of our past began to fade into the background. But that was the thing about unresolved stories. They had a way of reappearing when least expected. I was at a networking event, my evening slipping into a comfortable routine of introductions and small talk, when I saw him. Richard stood across the room, his presence unmistakable even from a distance. My heart gave a single, sharp beat. A moment of stillness passed between us as our eyes met. For a brief second, I wondered if he had come to speak, to explain further, to make more promises. But then I saw it in his face. A kind of resignation, a quiet acceptance that the chapter we once shared had closed for good. I didn't approach him. I didn't need to. What I had learned through the passage of time was that sometimes the most profound act of closure is simply walking away without a word. But as I turned to leave, a hand brushed lightly against my arm. I looked up, startled to see James standing there, his gaze steady and full of understanding. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer advice. He simply stood by my side, a quiet support that spoke louder than any words could. Together, we walked out of the room, leaving behind the ghosts of the past. Chapter 25. The Unwritten Future. The months that followed unfolded with a natural ease. James and I continued to navigate the world together, not as two people clinging to the remnants of old wounds, but as individuals who had found strength in each other, who respected each other's journey. And while we both still had our moments of hesitation, after all, life had taught us both to be cautious, we knew that the bond we shared was built on something deeper than anything we had experienced before. The world around me seemed to respond to this newfound peace. Opportunities arrived, ones I had once dreamed of but had never truly thought possible. Chapter 26. The Final Test. The peaceful cadence of my life had become a rhythm I could trust, each beat falling into place like a well-worn song. But, as with all things that seemed too perfect, there was a shadow waiting, silent, unseen, but always there, lurking at the edges of the world I had painstakingly built. It wasn't something I could have anticipated. Richard, having slipped into the past as I thought, had returned once more. This time, it wasn't in a professional setting or a chance encounter. It was calculated. A letter appeared on my desk. One afternoon, plain in its simplicity, the handwriting unmistakable. I need to see you. It's about the past, a debt that has to be paid. I stared at the words, my fingers hovering over the edge of the envelope as if afraid to open it. The past had never truly been settled. It had merely retreated into the recesses of my life, waiting for the moment when it would spring forth, demanding acknowledgement. But I had thought I was finished with it. You are stronger now, I reminded myself, the voice in my head steady, resolute. You have nothing left to prove. Still, the gravity of the words settled over me like a weight, and my heart began to beat faster, a wave of uncertainty sweeping through me. What could he want now? What more could he possibly take from me? Chapter 27. The Encounter. When I finally agreed to meet Richard, it was not from a place of vulnerability, but of curiosity. I had learned that curiosity, when tempered with the wisdom of experience, could be a powerful tool. I needed to know once and for all what this man, who had once shattered my world, still sought. The cafe was quiet, almost serene, the kind of place where time seemed to slow. The chairs and tables were set with an almost purposeful distance, and the soft hum of conversation created a dull backdrop to the tension that crackled between us. When he entered, his presence was still commanding, but there was a weariness to his movements that hadn't been there before. His eyes, once filled with arrogance and certainty, were now clouded with something else, regret perhaps. It was hard to say. I met his gaze as he approached, my expression unreadable. I wasn't sure what I expected. Apologies, perhaps, or some final attempt to justify his actions. But instead, he simply sat, his movements slow, as if each one was weighed down by something much heavier than his body. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, his voice rough, as though he hadn't used it in a while. I didn't respond immediately. There was no need for pleasantries. We both knew what had brought us here, and nothing else mattered. Finally, I spoke, my voice steady, a reflection of the person I had become. "What is it you want from me, Richard?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, his eyes never quite meeting mine. It was almost as if he were searching for the right words, though I doubted there were any that could truly undo what had been done. "I've made mistakes," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. I didn't realize what I had until I lost it. And now, seeing how you've built your life, how you've become who you are, I realize how much I destroyed. I was weak. I was selfish." I didn't interrupt him, letting his words hang in the air like an unspoken confession. There was a part of me that wanted to let the silence stretch on, to let him sit in the discomfort of his own regret. But I couldn't help but ask the question that had been burning inside me since the letter arrived. "Why now, Richard? After all this?" "Time, what do you want from me now?" For a moment he looked defeated, his shoulders slumped as if he had already braced himself for rejection. But then his eyes flickered with something like resolve. "I want you to know that I understand now. What I did to you, what I did to us, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal, and I can never undo it. But if you could find it in your heart to forgive me, not for you, but for me, I think it would give me the peace I've been looking for." There was a long pause. I felt the weight of his words settle deep inside me. Forgiveness. It was something I had given him in my own way long ago, but now it seemed that forgiveness had come full circle. It wasn't just for him anymore. It was for me, for my own peace. I took a deep breath, my mind swirling with the gravity of this moment. The pain that I had carried for so long, the resentment, had been a constant companion. But now, it seemed as though that chapter, that bitter era of my life, was finally drawing to a close. "I forgave you a long time ago," I said, my voice soft but firm. "Not because you deserved it, but because I did." Holding on to that anger, that pain, It wasn't helping me. But forgiveness doesn't mean that we can just pick up where we left off. It means we've both moved on. And that's where it ends. His face softened, and for a moment, I saw the man he could have. Been the man. Chapter 29. The Seeds of New Beginnings. The days that followed that final meeting with Richard were marked by a quiet transformation. The weight that had once been a constant companion pressing against my chest had dissipated. It didn't vanish. In an instant. Peace was never something so easily won, but it was as if the air around me had grown lighter. I woke each day with a sense of calm that I hadn't known in years. I could breathe more deeply now, every inhale filling me with the fresh promise of a future unwritten, a future I was beginning to take control of once more. There was still work to be done, of course, whether in my career or in the spaces I had carefully curated for healing. But this was the first time in a long while I felt like I was no longer running from my past. Chapter 30. The Awakening of Purpose. As I immersed myself in the next phase of my life, I felt an unexpected shift within the depths of my professional pursuits. The executive position I had been climbing toward had become more than just an ambition. It became a way to assert the sovereignty of my own story, to create ripples of change that reached beyond the walls of my office. I was no longer simply executing tasks or navigating boardroom politics. I was crafting a legacy. I had a vision now, a clear purpose that reached further than myself. I knew I wanted to create opportunities for others, to help them overcome the obstacles I had once faced, the ones that had tried to suffocate me. Empowerment had become my cause, and it was contagious. People responded. They saw the authenticity in my leadership, the steadiness with which I approached even the most turbulent situations. And James, well, he was a constant presence in my life now. His support, his faith in me had become an anchor, steadying me even when the winds of change threatened to stir up old uncertainties. It wasn't just that we were partners in love now, but in life, our dreams, our ambitions, intertwined. We built something together, a quiet but unshakable foundation, brick by brick, moment by moment. There were nights when we stayed up late, talking about everything and nothing, laughing about the small things that kept us grounded, planning for the bigger picture that loomed on the horizon. I reveled in the fact that he had never expected perfection from me. He never asked for a polished version of myself. He simply accepted me, flaws and all, and in that, I found the most freeing kind of love. Love that wasn't contingent upon meeting unattainable standards. Love that simply was. Chapter 31. The Reflection of a Changed Woman. One evening, as I sat alone in the dim glow of the candle-lit room, I allowed myself the rare indulgence of quiet reflection. I closed my eyes, feeling the steady pulse of my heartbeat beneath my skin. The room spinning in soft shadows as my mind drifted back to the path I had walked. I thought of Richard, of how he had come back into my life like a storm, only to dissipate with nothing but the silence of his regret left behind. I thought of the pain, the betrayal, and the way I had allowed it to shape my strength. I thought of how each misstep, each betrayal, each tear shed had woven itself into the woman I had become, the woman capable of standing tall, unshaken by the forces that had once tried to topple me. For the first time in years, I could look at myself in the mirror and see a reflection that was no longer burdened. It was as though the woman staring back at me was both the same and entirely different. There was no longer the sense of fear or hesitation, no longer a need to look over my shoulder to see if the past was still lurking behind me. The weight had been lifted. The chains had been broken. The future stretched before me like an open expanse. And in that moment, I could feel the full potential of it pulsing in the air, waiting for me to claim it. Chapter 32. A Quiet Victory. Months passed, and as the seasons changed, I felt myself growing, professionally, personally, and emotionally. James and I had settled into a rhythm of partnership, our lives intertwined in ways that were both exhilarating and comforting. The company I had once struggled to climb through now stood as a monument to my persistence, my transformation, and the relationships I had carefully cultivated. I had built a team of passionate individuals, each one of them carrying their own scars, their own struggles, but united by a shared vision. And as we worked together, as we moved toward our goals, I realized that my true legacy wasn't just in the success of the company. It was in the lives I had touched, the people I had inspired, the ways I had created space for others to rise and find their own strength. I had learned how to build not just a career, but a community. Chapter 33. An Invitation to the Future. One day, I received an invitation that would change the course of my life once again. A letter, not unlike the one from Richard years before. Chapter 34. The emergence of New Path's life, it seemed, had taken on a rhythm of its own, a steady pulse that matched the cadence of my heart. I had found peace in the chaos, a balance that was rare and beautiful, yet still fragile. But like everything in life, even the most well-ordered symphony can be interrupted by an unforeseen note, and this was no exception. It began with a message, a simple text that appeared on my phone one late afternoon while I was sitting in my office, reviewing some figures for the upcoming board meeting. The name that flashed on the screen made my pulse stutter, a name I had long since tried to forget. Richard. I stared at the message for a long moment before I dared to open it. A part of me felt nothing, empty and unmoved, while another part bristled with an edge I had not known I still carried. "We need to talk." That was all it said. I set the phone down slowly, my fingers trembling for reasons I couldn't fully comprehend. After all, wasn't this what I had wanted to leave behind? Hadn't I built an entire life of strength and independence, leaving all of that in the past? The answer was obvious, and yet, that small flicker of curiosity, the echo of a past I thought I'd left behind, began to gnaw at the edges of my thoughts. I had fought so long and hard to move on, to create something unshakable. What could he possibly want now? Chapter 35. Confrontation in the Dark. The meeting was arranged in a cafe on the outskirts of town, far from the world I had built. It felt like a place outside of time, a small haven where only the past and the present could collide, and where my future was temporarily suspended. When I arrived, I spotted him immediately, sitting at a table near the window, his posture rigid, his hands clasped tightly together. He hadn't changed much since I'd last seen him, except that his face seemed older now, wearied by the years. The lines around his eyes spoke of a life he'd lived without me, one filled with consequences I could only guess at. He looked up as I approached, and for a brief, suspended moment, there was nothing but silence between us. His eyes, those familiar but now distant eyes, held a vulnerability I hadn't expected. But I wasn't ready to soften. Not yet. "Sit down," he said quietly, his voice lacking the confident edge it once had. I took a seat across from him, maintaining the space between us as if it were a protective barrier. "I didn't think I'd hear from you again," I said, my tone even, betraying none of the conflicted emotions simmering beneath the surface. He let out a long, drawn-out sigh, rubbing his temples before meeting my gaze. "I know I don't deserve this. I don't deserve to ask anything of you after what I did, but please, hear me out." The words were loaded with regret. They were a promise of some kind, but the past echoed loudly between us, each syllable steeped in history. Still, I stayed quiet, waiting for him to continue. "Everything I did, everything we had, it was wrong. I was wrong. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the vulnerability that now poured through him. I wasn't the man I should have been. You were right to leave me, but I've spent years thinking about you, about what happened. I never stopped caring. I clenched my fists beneath the table, my knuckles turning white. He could still elicit feelings in me, anger, frustration, but not the love or longing he once had. That had long since vanished, replaced by something else, an understanding of my own strength. Richard, I said slowly, my voice sharp but controlled, I'm not the same person you knew. I've changed, and I've built something with my life, something real. I've forgiven you in my own way, but you need to understand that there's no place for you in my life anymore. Not as a lover, not as a friend, not even as an acquaintance. His face twisted with emotion, regret clouding his features. I understand, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. Chapter 36. A final farewell. The meeting was brief. He left me with his apologies, but those words were hollow now, echoing in a void I'd long since filled with my own purpose and resilience. The man I had once loved, the man I had once trusted, was nothing but a shadow of what I had imagined him to be. The reality of him, the truth of his choices, was now too much for me to bear, even in my heart. But as I left the cafe, my steps heavier than usual, I realized something. There was no bitterness left inside me, no desire for revenge, no thirst for retribution. It was all gone, replaced by something I hadn't expected. Peace. I had reached the point where I no longer needed answers from him or anyone else. I had taken ownership of my life, and in that ownership, I had discovered a quiet, abiding strength. Chapter 37. The Rebirth of Self. I walked away from the meeting, a sense of finality settling in my chest. Chapter 38. The unseen current's time flowed steadily, a river winding through the seasons of my life. Each moment was an echo of what had come before, and yet each one was distinctly new. In the aftermath of Richard's return and the eventual closure that I had forged within myself, a subtle shift began to take root, one that I had not anticipated. It wasn't a loud, dramatic change. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, like the steady erosion of a stone by water over time. The remnants of my former self, the woman who had been betrayed, the woman who had once cradled her pain in the palms of her hands, began to drift further away. But there were days when the silence of the evening would settle over me, when I would feel the cold edge of something deep within, something that reminded me of what I had once endured. It was a reminder, not of weakness, but of my resilience, of the strength I had cultivated through those dark years. It wasn't a wound anymore, not even a scar. It was a mark of who I had become. Chapter 39. Fragments of old dreams James had become my anchor, the steady force in my life. His presence, though quiet, was powerful in its own way. Where I had once feared vulnerability, his gentle understanding had allowed me to embrace it. But even in this, there was something deeper at play, something I had never fully acknowledged. There were nights when we would lie together, our bodies tangled beneath the weight of a shared warmth, and I would catch myself staring at the ceiling, thoughts swirling like a dance of shadows. In those moments, I wondered, was I truly ready for this life? For this love? James was everything Richard had not been. He was patient, understanding, kind, but in his kindness, there was still a part of me that recoiled, as if unsure of whether I truly deserved such tenderness. The fear that had once lived inside me, the fear of being hurt, of being betrayed again, still whispered in the back of my mind. It wasn't loud, but it was there, lurking in the quiet moments. I would pull away slightly at times, testing the boundaries of what was comfortable. But James never pressed, never demanded. He simply existed as he was, steady, strong, and without expectation. Chapter 40. The Reflection of Truth. One evening, a week after the cafe meeting with Richard, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, studying the woman I had become. The reflection that stared back at me was unfamiliar and yet comforting. The eyes that once shimmered with uncertainty and doubt now held a quiet strength. My lips, which had trembled with vulnerability and fear, were set in a firm, steady line. I was no longer the same woman who had once been shattered by betrayal. I had rebuilt myself from the ashes of that past, piece by piece, until I was whole again. But in this moment, I realized that rebuilding wasn't about erasing what had happened. It was about accepting it. Accepting the parts of me that had been broken, the parts that had been scarred, and the parts that had healed. "You are enough," I told myself, the words resonating in the stillness of the room. It wasn't an epiphany. It was a quiet acceptance, a knowing that I had grown into something greater, something more, and yet there was still room for more growth, for more learning. The path I had walked, the choices I had made, had brought me to this moment of peace. But the journey was far from over. Chapter 41. Uncharted Waters. As the months passed, I began to allow myself to dream again. Not of a life where I was constantly seeking retribution or looking over my shoulder for the next betrayal, but of a life where I could truly live for myself. I began to envision a future not defined by my past, but by my own aspirations and desires. James and I spoke more openly about the future, our dreams interwoven in a way that felt effortless. We had plans. Small ones, big ones, but they were ours, shared between two people who were learning how to live fully in the present. There was no room for ghosts in that space, no room for past betrayals to take root, and yet, even as I moved forward, I understood that the past would always be there, lurking in the background, like a shadow that followed me wherever I went. But I had learned to live with it. It no longer dictated my actions or my choices. It no longer held the power to control me. Chapter 42. The Full Circle. One evening, as I was walking through the park near our home, the air crisp with the onset of winter, I spotted Richard across the way. He didn't see me at first, but as our eyes met, the recognition was instant. He hadn't changed much, still the same man who had once held my heart in his hands and shattered it in the same breath. But this time, I wasn't angry. There was no bitterness, no yearning for vengeance. There was only neutrality. He was a part of my past, but he didn't define my present or my future. I nodded at him, the briefest of acknowledgments.